Hello, everyone. My name is Sisanda Ngwala. The title of this presentation is Appropriating Mandelaism to Promote Harmony and Reconciliation Amid a Global Crisis, a rhetorical analysis of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's speeches on the coronavirus pandemic. I am based at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, where I am a senior lecturer in the media department. I hold a PhD in rhetoric studies from the University of Cape Town. And my co-author and co-presenter is Sikelelwa Tlanga, who holds an MA in political communications and is an independent researcher. I will now hand over to Sikelelwa to talk us through who Cyril Ramaphosa is, the current South African president, and why his rhetoric is of interest in the study.
Cyril Ramaphosa is South Africa's fifth democratically elected president. He first assumed the caretaker president role in February 2018, after then President Jacob Zuma announced his resignation after being recalled by the African National Congress amidst mounting allegation of state capture. In 2017, in his campaign to remove Zuma, Ramaphosa positioned himself as a savior from Zuma's failed leadership. He termed his era the New Dawn for South Africa's economy. The ascension to power would prove significant as it positioned him as a hero that would step in to turn the country's prospects around after the so-called 9 wasted years under Zuma's leadership. He was later officially elected into power after the 2019 general election, based on his promises to turn the country around. That's from February 2019. Ramaphosa has previously been touted to be the successor of South Africa's first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela, and is often viewed as Mandela's preferred candidate for the role, even though Thabo Mbeki was eventually elected and installed by the ANC branches in 1997. He took presidential office in 2019 with the new term, the New Dawn, as a symbol of a new time in South Africa. The New Dawn was silently commenting on the previous presidential term, which was associated with corruption and state capture by an Indian family known as the Guptas. Through the New Dawn, he associates himself with Mandela's New South Africa, and the New Dawn itself is a play on the term of the New South Africa. Little is understood about Ramaphosa's political ideological convictions and philosophy, and as such, there does not appear to be much research that has considered his approach to persuasion. It appears as though he chose to silence as a tactical political strategy since the early 90s. Lodge 1993, page 71, observes that Cyril Ramaphosa gives many interviews, but he keeps his personal philosophy to himself. In his current role as the President of South Africa, he has been forced out of this silence because his leadership is closely tied to his ability to persuade South Africans that he is the right man for the job. The coronavirus crisis has provided for an occasion where he is forced to communicate on an ongoing basis. In so doing, it provided an opportune moment to consider how he employs persuasive techniques and how these may betray his inferred ideas about South African people and the South African nations. Our examination of these has found that Ramaphosa is inclined to appropriate, at times emulate harmonious and reconciliatory rhetoric most commonly associated with Mandelaism. Whether this is deliberate or is a byproduct of having been Mandela's prodigy is unclear. Nevertheless, what is clear is that in portions of the speech he delivered to South Africans at the start of the coronavirus crisis in the country, Ramaphosa's rhetoric had aspects most commonly associated with Mandelaism.
So in looking at this issue of Mandelaism, Nelson Mandela's rhetoric has been widely studied, focusing on his unmatched abilities to use words to encourage reconciliation. From his 1964 treason trial speech to the 1994 speech he delivered at his inauguration as South Africa's first Black democratically elected president, his work is widely quoted and is used in various literature, in the press, biographies, television, and scholarly publications. This notion of Mandelaism is a term that has been derived from the mythologizing of Nelson Mandela. And for this study, the notion of Mandelaism that has been used is one that has been conceptualized by Mpofu and Chasi, where they define Mandelaism as an idea that draws on patriotic sentiments, often invoking notions of magical powers to reconcile racial divisions, to right wrongs of the past, and to nation build. And it's based on mythologizing Nelson Mandela, excuse me, and imagining a South African nation characterized by harmony, peace, reconciliation, and success, denying the significance of informational disturbances that contradict these narratives. While specifically called Mandelaism, this notion is not solely characteristic of Mandela, but the general rhetoric around imaginations concerning democratic South Africa. And in our paper, we have used Mandelaism and crisis rhetoric to consider how Ramaphosa used notions of reconciliation and success to frame the South African government's approach to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Amos Kiwe defines crisis rhetoric as the discourse initiated by decision makers in an attempt to communicate to various constituencies that a certain development is critical and to suggest a certain course of action to remedy the critical situation. Our focus then is on the certain course of action to remedy the critical situation, wherein we are considering how Ramaphosa employed ideas closely linked with Mandelaism as a means of persuading South Africans of the government's response to the pandemic as being appropriate. This type of crisis rhetoric, typically epididic, is used to respond to events that are seen as critical. So for our study, we employed a case study as our research design. The data collected were 4 televised speeches, which were delivered between March 24th and April 21st of 2020, excuse the typo here, which is basically when South Africa went into lockdown at the start of the coronavirus outbreak here. The speeches were delivered live, and so we had those recordings that were available. We also had the transcripts of the speeches, so we were able to do a close reading of those in our analysis. And our analysis technique was a rhetorical analysis, where we were looking at the way words were used as a means of persuasion.
Harmony, peace, reconciliation. Mandelaism manifests in the iconization of Nelson Mandela as a symbol of an imagined mythic South African nation to produce false legitimacy and belonging that's according to Mpofu and Chassis in 2017. President Ramaphosa begins each of his 4 speeches with "my fellow South Africans." We see this in all his 4 speeches, March the 9th, 2020, March 24th, April 9th, April 21st. The tone of these words, opening words as a greeting, is familiarity, evoking a sense of belonging to every South African. This mode of salutation is a shortcut in political communication language for the imagined mythic South African nationhood ideals of togetherness, inclusivity, and reconciliation in times of crisis. My fellow South Africans, again, is a shortcut to the audience for a unified, overcoming, reconciled nation is supported by evidence throughout all four speeches. Mandelaism manifests in the iconization of Nelson Mandela as a symbol of an imagined mythic South African nation to produce false legitimacy and belonging, according to Bofu and Jesse. President Cyril Ramaphosa begins each of his four speeches with my fellow South Africans, as in the four speeches. The tone of these opening words as a greeting as a shortcut for a unified, overcoming, reconciled nation, supported by evidence throughout all four speeches, from religious leaders to sporting associations, from political parties to business, from trade unions to traditional leaders, from NGOs to public servants. Every part of our society has come forward. He says this in his speech in March 24th, 2020. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, black and white, those who live in the cities and those in the villages, he says this in the next speech in March 30, 2020. This reconciliation inclusivity rhetoric finds its effectiveness mainly when used within moments of national crisis, since it is how it was forged during the Mandela years. Mandela was a more effective messenger of this inclusivity, as he was the face and the very embodiment of the national crisis throughout his life, as one who fought against apartheid, addressed the white oppressive regime during the treason trial, when he first injected the notions of an inclusive society, after which he was imprisoned for 27 years. Ramaphosa uses this Mandelaism rhetoric in the context of crisis, however, not as one who has suffered. He addresses the nation as a billionaire president whose name is further muddied by the first massacre of the post-apartheid South Africa. My fellow South Africans, as inclusive language is effective because of the psychological power of priming and use of shortcuts for political communication. The language arouses national memory of an imagined reconciliation during the Mandela years, where bloodshed was halted. The president arouses reconciliation in the context of crisis, imploring citizens to remember historical pains that have been overcome. We South Africans are a people who come together and unite at moments of crisis, close quote, April 9th, 2020, in his speech. Throughout the four speeches, where the overcoming and togetherness of South Africans are brought to national consciousness, Mandela is being recalled. This manufactures a temporary aura of harmony, unity, and reconciliation. Mandela is present though salient, as the president addresses the nation. My fellow South Africans, Mandela is projected through motives of resilience, racial harmony, national unity, harmony, and working together in the address.
The second key findings related to this notion of denying the significance of informational disturbances that contradict these narratives around harmony, peace, and reconciliation that Mbofu and Chasi indicate is central to this notion of Mandelaism. So for this particular aspect, we considered silence as a rhetorical device and sought to consider the aspects of Ramaphosa's speech where he uses silence to communicate. Writing about rhetoric and silence, Robert Scott notes that every decision to say something is a decision not to say something else. That is, if the utterance is a choice, in speaking, we remain silent, and in remaining silent, we speak. In the case of Ramaphosa, consideration was given to instances where one would have expected him to say something, but instead he remained silent about it in his addresses that we considered. In his case, silence really isn't about the absence of speech, we argue, but rather the decision to speak about something else in order to maintain this sense of harmony, of peace and reconciliation. An example of this in one of the speeches we considered are delivered on March 30th, after South Africa had been in lockdown for around 3 days. During the early stages of the lockdown, the South African National Defence Force was deployed to assist with law enforcement operations, particularly in ensuring the public did not contravene lockdown regulations. Amid this, there was public outcry on the aggressive and violent approach employed by the soldiers towards civilians. In the March 30th address, it was expected that the president would condemn these actions unequivocally when he spoke about them. However, instead, in passing, he stated, they, the SANDF, the South African National Defence Force, know that they must act within the law at all times and that they must not cause harm to any of our people. And in this statement, we see him talking about the issue, but in a way that really glosses over it and hence denies its significance. He does not directly address them and call them out for the violence that was meted out, and merely passively alludes to the issue. Earlier in the speech, he had been lauding the people of South Africa for acting in a disciplined manner, but when it comes to the SANDF matter, he does not directly address it. He also, we found, uses silence as a rhetorical device by denying or minimizing dissenting voices and views. And examples of this that we found in his speeches, where on the March 23rd speech, he says, millions of our people have understood the gravity of the situation. And then on the April 9th speech, he says, and then there is each of you, the 58 million South African citizens and residents who are standing together as one in confronting the national health emergency. Here, we argue that the denials arise when he does not acknowledge that not all South Africans viewed the pandemic as such, and that many did not see it as a health emergency. Mpofu and Chasi discuss how Mandelaism locks Mandela into a narrative order of forgetting, which ignores apartheid's oppression. One can argue that in this rhetoric, Ramaphosa attempts to lock South Africans into a narrative order of ignoring the fact that there were dissenting voices on the pandemic and how it was being dealt with. The use of objections and counter-arguments is an established and persuasive communication strategy because it directly deals with opposing views. However, Ramaphosa appears in his speeches not to prefer this approach, perhaps because the idea of dissent is not congruent with Mandelaism and the notion of unity that is upheld by this view that all South Africans want the same thing. In Mandela's case, it was the so-called reconciliation project, the Rainbow Nation, and in this specific case of Ramaphosa, it was concerning support for the government's programs when dealing with COVID-19. One could argue that in these instances, silence is being weaponized. Arguably, it is how Ramaphosa, we argue, focuses the country on the positive attributes and controls negative news and criticism in these instances. We found that through keeping certain things that were disagreeable to the narrative out of his address, key developments, he then eliminates the negatives from his speeches and creates an imagined reality where all that exists is what he names. However, this silencing rhetoric may have an opposite effect, where viewers and citizens focus on what has not been named, as, for example, was the case with the SANDF soldiers and the violence they meted out against citizens. Silence, we argue, is a rhetorical device that Ramaphosa wields with intent. And we actually, after analyzing and looking at his speeches, would argue that it is one of his key rhetorical devices. I will now hand back to Sigi, who will conclude.
The national addresses delivered during the lockdown provided unusual opportunities for the nation to pay attention to President Ramaphosa's words, since their lives depended on it. Ramaphosa seized the moment and attempted to rebrand the nation back to Mandelaism, where notions of peace, harmony, reconciliation were central themes. President Ramaphosa had more opportunities to address the nation in a shorter space of time than any other president before him. This allows him his style of rhetoric to be noticeable as a family meeting or fellow South Africans who trend on social media as the nation anticipates another speech. This paper has established the Mandelaism that emerged from his speech. South Africa's response to the pandemic has been lauded, playing into the Mandelaism notion that Mandela was an exceptional light in the darkness, as Mbofu and Chasi in 2017. And this exceptionalism comes through in Ramaphosa's rhetoric as he positions the interventions made by the government in response to the coronavirus pandemic in exaggerated and flattering terms, often juxtaposing these two nations that he suggests have not been as decisive. The other idea around success as embodied in Mandelaism suggests one value must be sacrificed for another, namely restitution for reconciliation, as Mbofu and Chasi defined in 2017. Ramaphosa's rhetoric is silent on the aspects where the government has erred in its response to the pandemic, and yet very pronounced on its successes, attributing these to the fundamental values espoused in Mandelaism, namely harmony and reconciliation.